Hi again, welcome back. In the last video we covered part 4, section 1, which talked about crop provisions and the different types of coverage that you can have on a 471. In this video we're going to be covering section 2, which deals specifically with crop data. Most of the paragraphs are going to apply more to the state office and to the state committee than they do to county offices, so we're going to move pretty quick through this section. But it's good for county office employees to have an understanding or an idea of what sorts of information are gathered, the process for changing yields and prices and things like that, so that if you ever need to propose a new price or a new crop or anything like that, you have an idea of what's expected. So to get started, we'll go to paragraph 275. Each year, the state committee is responsible for gathering information about the crops that are covered under NAP in the state. If the crop is used for anything other than grazing, then the state committee is going to have to determine 3 things: the average market price for that crop, the county expected yield, and any applicable payment factors. The deadline for that, as we've heard before, is 120 days before the specific crop's application closing deadline. If the crop is a grazing crop, then the state committee needs to look at 2 factors: the carrying capacity and the grazing period. Those are also set each year. The deadline for those changes are 90 days before the earliest applicable sales closing date for forage. On occasion, a crop is going to be requested that we don't have on the crop table currently. You can check Exhibit 14 of the NAP Handbook to see a list of all of the NAP crops that are potentially covered under the program. And if the crop that you're looking for is not in there, then you might want to make a recommendation to the state committee that that crop be added to the crop table. If the state committee concurs and believes that that crop should be added, then they're going to need to make that recommendation down to Washington, D.C. And when they make the recommendation, they need to provide some additional information. For starters, they need to have the specific crop's name, type, variety, and intended use. It's possible that the crop you're looking to add is already or closely related to an existing crop, say lettuce, but that specific variety is not added yet. So in which case you'd be associating them with the existing crop, but you'd be creating a new type. Additionally, the state committee will need to submit whatever the scientific name is of that crop. They need to send minutes from the meeting when they discussed the crop and made the recommendation for adding it. And then lastly, they need to supply the supporting documentation that they reviewed when making their determination. Supporting documents could include information about commercial markets currently available for that crop, if there's any NAS data available for the crop or yield data from other sources, pricing information, things like that. In addition to the required information that the state committee needs to update annually, they have the option at their discretion to also update organic average market prices and yields and direct market prices. Again, this is optional. It's not required for every crop, but if there are specific crops that are grown organically or sold directly to consumers in the state, then it may be worthwhile for the state committee to consider those. When the state committee is setting their price and yields, they can look at up to the most recent 7 years of data available to them. Those 7 years must be consecutive. They can't be skips, and so if they are missing any years in that period, the information prior to that break in data is not applicable. One of the most important pieces of information for running the NAP program in a county is to have county expected yield data. That's sort of the benchmark that we are measuring producers' production against. That's also the basis for creating a new producer's estimated expected yield, or their APHs. The county expected yield is sometimes also referred to as the T yield. This information can be specific from county to county, but the state committee is responsible for setting it statewide, and so it's very common for a specific crop to be assigned a single county expected yield for all of the counties in the state. The county expected yield should reflect the average production potential of the crop in the county by practice and intended use. Obviously, you're going to have some growers that are doing a better job than others. You're also going to have certain practices that might lend themselves to having higher yields. Growing the crop in high tunnel, for instance, or using drip irrigation or a specific type of seed. Those can all have pretty dramatic impacts on crop yield. The objective of the county expected yield is to come up with an average yield for routine or for common farming operations. Sources for this information can include APHs that are coming from other producers of that crop in the county. That's one of the easiest sources of data for existing crops. COC's knowledge about the crops. You can also get information from the state or local county ag offices. Get information from NASS, National Ag Statistical Service. RMA if they have this crop available for crop insurance. And other reliable sources as applicable. The state committee is going to want to take a look at the proposed yield information that they gather each year and compare it to previous years to make sure that it's reasonable or in line with prior years' production totals. Whenever they're establishing a county expected yield, they're going to use what's called an Olympic average. The way that that's done is by looking at the most recent 5 years of information and then dropping the high and dropping the low and then doing the simple average of the remaining 3. As we mentioned before, the county expected yield is also referred to as the T yield. As we get into the APH process, which is how we establish the producer's expected yields, we're going to use the phrase T yield in place of county average pretty often. When the state committee is establishing those yields, they're going to want to look to see if crop insurance is available on that crop anywhere within the state. If they are, then they're going to want to look to set yield information similar to how it is established through RMA. Specifically, if it's available in a certain county, what the county average yield should be in that county. Also, how it relates to contiguous counties. Always, the state committee must identify and document how the established county expected yield was determined. The state committee also has the discretion to set different yields for different farming practices. In other words, if a crop is irrigated and non-irrigated in the county, that irrigated crop may have a higher yield than the non-irrigated crop, in which case the state committee is completely within their authority to set different yields for the different irrigation practices. Additionally, different types of a crop could also have different yields. If a specific type or variety of a given crop is known to have much larger yields than other varieties of that same crop, they are certainly within their rights to set the yield appropriately. Additionally, the state committee must establish a county expected yield for NAP crops when documentation used to establish the county expected yield show a substantial difference in the expected yield because the crop is harvested for a different intended use, such as fresh versus processed. The exception here is that multiple market crops are only going to have a single yield set, as you see here in paragraph 276G. So a crop like apples, which is marketed as fresh and processed, is going to have just a single yield set. For organic crops, if RMA data is available, then you're going to be using those yields and prices. However, if it's not available, then the state committee is going to be responsible for setting the organic yields based on the best data available. That could be coming from NASS, it could be coming from actual yields of organic growers of that crop. But in either case, the state committee is going to have to document that decision very well. If data does not exist for the crop or similar crop in the county, in the state, or in similar areas, the state committee may establish an organic or transition yield factor not to exceed 75% of the conventional county expected yield. In other words, if we don't have great data to show what the yield for organic, say, okra is, they could decide to take the conventional yield for okra and reduce it by a set percentage. As long as it's less, or as long as it's at least 75% of the conventional yield, then there's no review from DAFP required, or there's no approval from DAFP required. For grazed crops, the state committee also has to set carrying capacities. Carrying capacity means a stocking rate and the number of days grazing can normally be sustained without detrimental effects to the land resources, excluding any supplemental feedstuff. Feedstuff in this case is defined as any product of natural or artificial origin that has nutritional value in the ration when properly prepared. The state committee is also going to want to look at grazing periods to determine the total number of grazing days expected for a given area in the state. One county further to the north might have a shorter grazing period than a county further south that might have a more mild climate. Lastly, stocking rate. The stocking rate must reflect the specific number of acres of forage capable of supporting 1 AU, or animal unit, for the specific grazing days. The example they list below says the state committee determined 7 acres of IGS mixed forage is required to support 1 animal unit. The state committee is responsible for reviewing the carrying capacities of each county annually. Average market prices are used to help determine the value of a crop. The average market price is the accumulation of sales data across all marketing channels that are sold throughout the state. It's supposed to represent how the majority of the crop is marketed. So if you've got one specific part of the state that markets the majority of a crop, then the price data is probably going to reflect that area's pricing more than it would elsewhere in the state. Whenever we say average market price, we'll a lot of times refer to it as being the wholesale price. And the reason for that is because the majority of a lot of crops in the state are sold primarily as wholesale to either a shipper or packer or to a distributor. And so the average market price typically is going to be pretty heavily skewed towards whatever the wholesale price would be for that crop. But it is literally the average market price, the average price received for that crop in the open market in New York State. The state committees will set those average market prices with the best information they can, which is going to come from COC knowledge, the state or county ag departments, local market data, NAS information if it's available, prices in similar areas throughout the state or neighboring states, and any other reliable source such as AMS or Ag Marketing Service data. If NAS has data for the eligible crop, the state committee must consider NAS information when establishing crop data. However, the state committees are not required to base the establishment on only NAS data. When determining the average market price, the state committee is going to take the Olympic average of the most recent 5 consecutive crop years, the same way that they do when they're setting the county average yields. The state committee is going to disregard small differences in price for crops based on different types of varieties. However, if there is a substantial difference in price between 2 different varieties of the same crop, then they are authorized to set prices accordingly. When we have these prices, the average market price, the direct market price, the organic marketing price, we're going to be applying those depending on what type of coverage the producer has. And the specific rules for which price is actually applied in which situation is always going to benefit the producer to the maximum extent possible. So if a producer has basic coverage, or if they have buy-up but they didn't do any additional pricing options, then we're always going to use just the average market price. However, if a customer has chosen buy-up coverage and direct marketing price option, then we're going to use the higher of the direct market price or the average market price if the DMP, their direct marketing percentage, would make their portion of direct marketing price lower than the average market price, which is exceptionally rare. I can't think of any occurrence that would actually happen. Producers don't need to have buy-up coverage in order to get the organic pricing option. So even producers that have basic coverage, if they elect the organic option, we will give them either the national crop table average market price for that crop or the organic market price, whichever is higher. And if a producer has the works, if they've got organic pricing and direct marketing prices, elected on their 471 application for coverage, then we're going to apply whatever price is the highest and most beneficial to that producer. In any case where a crop is insurable in any part of the state and crop insurance has a price set for that crop, that price needs to be the price applied to the entire state for that crop. So we just talked about the different prices that we set and how those can impact a producer's coverage. We're now going to be looking at these things called payment factors. Payment factors are applied to a claim to try and better account for the actual expense borne by the producer. As we discussed in an earlier video, somebody that was prevented from planting the crop will not have borne all the same expenses as someone that has planted the crop or somebody that's also taken the crop to harvest. So these payment factors are set to try and adjust that price down as a percentage of the full market price. Average market prices for the crops will always be established based on a harvested basis. So the quote harvested payment factor would be 100% of whatever the average market price is. The average market price will be adjusted for crops produced with variable expenses that are not incurred because the crop acreage was either prevented from being planted or planted but not harvested. Payment factors are set for the state, and each intended use of a crop is going to have only a single prevented planting factor or a single unharvested factor. Those factors should be the same for the entire state. It's also important to note that the application of a payment factor is not appealable. In other words, if a producer was prevented from planting the crop and we apply this prevented planting factor to their payment, they can't say, well, I'd like to appeal applying that factor. I don't think that that's fair. I don't like it. They can't actually appeal the rule that says you need to do this. The only thing that they could appeal is the application of the rule. So if they were to say, well, no, I tried planting the crop, but I wasn't actually able to. I brought the tractor out to the field. I did all of these things that would have been the same as planting the crop. They could try and argue that, but for the most part it's going to be pretty straightforward, and it's unlikely that someone would actually try and form an appeal based on something like that. We're going to talk about appeals and what is an appealable decision made by the county committee later on. We're going to have a specific video that covers nothing but appeals because they can be a little bit complicated and there's a lot to consider when you are actually forming an appeal. So that's actually it for part 4. We covered section 1, crop provisions, and we just finished section 2, crop data. So again, in section 1 we looked at all the different types of coverage that's available to a producer and some of the variables that can affect how their coverage actually applies. In section 2 we just looked at how the data for those crops is set, who's responsible for doing what. The next video we're going to be doing part 5, sections 1 and 2, which goes into how a producer actually obtains coverage for NAP. That application is taken on form CCC 471. So we're going to go through what information is required to fill that out and how you actually do that with a producer.